The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. Before we dive into the story, tell us where you're watching from. A small, trembling voice whispered, "I'm scared, and I can't find my mommy." It sounded like any lost child, frightened in the middle of the night. But then came the single word that froze the nurse in place. Blanket. She heard the familiar mispronunciation, the one she had known since bedtime routines at home. Her blood ran cold. At that same hour, in a hospital washed in fluorescent light, her night was already unfolding in its usual rhythm, until this call broke the stillness. The rhythm of the night shift had its own steady pulse. The halls lay quiet, broken only by the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the muted swish of sneakers against polished floors. Even the mechanical beeping of monitors felt like part of the soundtrack, marking time in a place that rarely slept. Sarah moved easily through that pattern, her hands flipping charts and scanning vitals with practiced ease. Years of repetition had made the motion second nature, yet the routine still carried weight. Every check, every number mattered. The silence around her wasn't emptiness. It was responsibility, measured in breaths and heartbeats. Behind her calm, the personal cost lingered. Working nights meant missing bedtime stories and morning hugs. Bills needed paying, shifts had to be covered, and this was the compromise. Sometimes, when the halls fell too still, a flicker of guilt would touch her thoughts. She could picture her daughter, curled under a butterfly comforter at home, secure but out of reach. That image was enough to keep her moving, to remind her why these hours mattered. The hospital itself seemed to mimic a sleeping body. Monitors like steady heartbeats, footsteps like the whisper of breath. It wasn't soothing exactly, but it was predictable. And in that predictability, Sarah found a rhythm that almost held her steady, a thin arm of order in long, lonely nights. At the nurse's station, she paused to record a set of notes in the charting system. Her stethoscope rested warm against her collarbone, its weight a reminder of both roles she carried. The caregiver here, the mother at home. She leaned back slightly, stretching her shoulders before glancing up at the wall clock. The hands sat close to 3, time passing in its usual quiet march. Most nights carried this same blend of watchfulness and waiting. Rounds, charting, soft exchanges with fellow nurses trading updates in hushed tones. There was a sameness in it, but sameness could be comforting. As long as the rhythm held, you could trust that things were under control. Yet she also knew that trust was fragile. Small events, a change in a patient's breathing, a sudden alarm, a phone ringing, could shatter it in an instant. That possibility was always there, unspoken beneath the surface calm, reminding her that work on nights like these was never just about routine. It was about being ready for whatever broke the stillness. Her pen scratched one last line in the notes. She looked to the clock again. 2:47 a.m. The sharp ring of the phone split the quiet. It wasn't another medication order. It wasn't a standard request. The sound itself carried urgency, and as she reached for the receiver, the night's rhythm gave way to something entirely different. The unexpected call began with a voice far too small for a hospital phone line. Sarah lifted the receiver, her greeting steady, practiced, almost automatic. Emergency department, Nurse Jenkins speaking. What came back was not the usual calm of an adult asking about visiting hours, nor the practical tone of a colleague requesting medication orders. It was a whisper, soft, halting, the tremor of a child holding back tears. "I'm scared and I can't find my mommy." The words cut through the nurse's station like warm breath against cold glass. Fluorescent lights glared overhead, but the voice on the line shrank that world down to something fragile, pressing, and human. Sarah straightened in her chair, her hand firm on the phone, sliding instantly into the role she knew mattered most. Steady, clear, calm. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm here to help." "Can you tell me where you are right now?" Small, uneven breaths rattled through the line. "I don't know." "It's dark outside. There's lights and cars going by." "Are you inside or outside?" Sarah kept her words lean, deliberate. "Outside." The answer came quick, threaded with fear. I see a big red sign and a parking lot with lots of cars. Sarah pressed the phone tighter to her ear. The details mattered. Are you safe where you're standing? Any people nearby? No, just cars. The child's voice cracked, rushing out in sobs. I want my mommy. Behind her calm tone, Sarah's chest tightened. This wasn't about medicine or machines. This was about a child, young and adrift, hunched somewhere by the side of a road while the world sped past. She softened her breathing so the fear in her chest would not slip through the line. Can you tell me how you got there? Did you walk from home? A pause. A small swallow of air. Then I just walked and walked. I thought I could find the hospital. My mommy works at the hospital. The last words tumbled out, breaking into a muffled sob. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. You're doing so well, sweetheart. I'm going to help you. For now, can you stay right where you are? Yes, the child whispered, the syllable stretched by tears. Sarah's mind ticked over the information. Red sign, busy cars, parking lot, near a wall. She pictured the streets that wrapped around the hospital grounds, the smaller businesses tucked at the edges, the rows of glowing company signs that turned corners into landmarks. She kept the child talking, her own questions threaded with reassurance. But even as she worked through her mental map, something else began to stir. It wasn't only fear in that voice. There was something more, something about the way the child spoke, the shape of sounds, the rhythm of phrases. Details she couldn't ignore started pressing against her professional calm, pulling at her on a deeper, more personal level. Sarah leaned closer to the receiver, her hand tightening on the notepad. It was not only the child's fear that pulled her attention, but the way the words came out. When the little voice said she was cold and wished she had her wanket, that one word, fragile and slightly bent, Sarah's pen stopped mid-stroke. A long inhale caught in her chest. That sound wasn't generic. It wasn't the slip of a stranger's speech. It was precise, personal. The same rounded lisp she had heard during bedtime requests night after night. The faint distortion of a single word carried more weight than a full description could have. It landed with the force of recognition. Then came another tell. Not dramatic, just the small grammar quirk of a first grader still stitching language together. The child said, "The cars goes fast." The kind of phrasing Sarah had coached through while reviewing homework at her own kitchen table. One misturned line might be chance. Two together was something else. She steadied her breathing, her voice careful now. Each question a test, gently disguised as comfort. Do you have a special stuffed animal that helps you feel brave? The reply came too quickly, too sure to be invented. Muffled words pressed into fabric. Mr. Snuggles. He has one ear that's floppy. Sarah's heartbeat jumped, and her hand drifted instinctively to her sternum. Mr. Snuggles was not just any toy. Her daughter's bear wore faded blue pajamas and had an ear that slumped from rough hugs. The stitching on one paw had grown thin where small fingers rubbed it for courage. Every mark, every imperfection was both ordinary and entirely unique. The description reached into her life with unnerving accuracy. A single coincidence might be overlooked. The wrong sound in a word could be dismissed. But the layered details, the wanket, the skewed phrasing, and now a floppy-eared bear with pajamas, built into something larger. They settled against her mind like puzzle pieces, sliding into place. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Charts and rounds, alarms and protocols, all of that fell away from view. What remained was the image of a bedroom she could picture without effort. A butterfly comforter pulled to a child's chin, a worn bear resting at the pillow's edge, and the soft, mispronounced words that filled evening routines with both frustration and warmth. Her training pulled at her to keep composure. She still asked the necessary questions, still guided the trembling voice with careful reassurance. Yet the nurse's detachment was slipping. What stood in its place was a mother's awareness, the unshakable bond of sound and memory, stronger than any fact she could write in a report. Sarah stayed steady on the surface, but inside her heartbeat was sharp, uneven. She pressed her free hand flat against her chest, as if she could ground herself against the evidence building between every syllable. And then another thought edged forward, quiet but insistent. If it really was her child's voice, why would that call have reached this desk at all? Sarah's training steadied her, even as her chest tightened. It struck her immediately. Children are taught to dial 911 in danger, not a hospital's main number. That single detail stood out, tugging at the edges of her focus. "How did you know to call this number, sweetie?" she asked. Her tone kept soft but clear. The reply came, shaking, thin as tissue. It was on the fridge, on a magnet. It said City General Hospital, and showed a picture of the big building. Her breath caught. She knew that magnet. Blue background, hospital name in white, and a tiny sketch of the front doors. She had tucked it on their refrigerator over a year ago, a simple giveaway from a community health fair. To a frightened child, it would have been the most obvious, familiar lifeline, right there at eye level, near her drawing papers and snack time drinks. "Why didn't you call 911? Sarah pressed, her questions clipped by worry but quiet in tone. I couldn't remember it," the child admitted. "But Mommy said if I ever got scared and she wasn't here, I could call where she works. She said you help people." The words were painfully logical in their own way. A child doesn't think in protocols or emergency manuals. They grasp what feels safe, what they recognize. And for one small girl, the hospital number was the closest thing to holding her mother's hand. "Can you tell me what the magnet looks like?" Sarah asked, though some part of her already knew. The answer came steady, rehearsed in familiarity. "It's blue and white. It has the hospital's name and the front doors drawn on it. It's right next to my rainbow picture." Her hand trembled. That crayon rainbow had been taped beside the magnet for months. She could see it in her mind, the colors pressed hard into paper, the uneven arches that only a child's hand could draw. Now those same details spilled through the phone, mapping her kitchen wall as though the child were standing in front of it. The quiet order of the nurse's station suddenly shifted around her. The hum of lights seemed sharper, the clinic's air more stifling. Every detail matched too cleanly. The magnet, the rainbow, the language. It was all converging into something undeniable. Behind her calm voice, a mother's knowledge was rooting itself deeper, spreading in the hollow of her chest. Still, she could not let panic bleed into her words. The only way forward was to keep the child talking, giving her small prompts that might ground them both. Precision mattered here, just enough to guide the moment without startling the voice on the other end of the line. Her hand smoothed the edge of a notepad, steadying herself. She would keep her voice even. She would ask the right questions, as any nurse should. But now those questions would reach further into a much more personal territory. And each answer might bring her closer to the truth she was already bracing to hear. Sarah steadied her breathing and chose her words with care. "Can you tell me about your room? What does it look like when you wake up?" The voice wavered at first, then grew a little stronger. "It's pink, with butterflies on the walls. In the morning, the sun makes shapes on my bed." Her hand froze above the notepad. Butterfly wallpaper. The east-facing window where light cut across the sheets just after dawn. Images she knew too well. Details so precise they stopped her breath for a beat. She cleared her throat quietly, guiding the next question. "What do you like to do during the week?" "I go to dance class on Tuesdays. I wear a blue leotard. Mrs. Parker says I'm getting better at skipping." Sarah's pulse jumped. Tuesday lessons. The precise name of the teacher. The same words she'd heard repeated after each class, spoken with pride in small bursts at the dinner table. Another pause, this one heavier. She pressed on. "Do you have a favorite toy that helps you feel safe?" "Mr. Snuggles," the child whispered quickly. "His ear flops down." That detail struck like a stone dropped in still water. The bear in faded pajamas with one ear bent from years of clutching. A single sentence that cut through the last remnants of doubt. 3 points. Each vivid, each exact, and each tied without question to Emily's world. Sarah felt the steady cadence of her professional calm begin to crack. Short, sharp breaths filled the empty space between her words as she kept the conversation moving, though her mind was no longer cataloging evidence like any other night's call. It was landing in her chest, fast and undeniable. The phone line hummed faintly with static. Sarah stared past the nurse's station, but what she saw was not the white corridors around her. She saw the corner of a bedroom wall, where paper butterflies peeled slightly at the edges, She saw the trusted dance bag leaning against the front door, straps tangled from careless tossing. She saw the small bear, clutched so tightly his stuffing had settled uneven over time. For a moment, her hand shook above the counter before she pressed it flat, grounding herself. The little voice on the other end needed consistency, needed calm. Sarah kept her tone gentle, asked another soft question about nearby lights, about whether the child could see anyone close by. But inside, everything had shifted. The distance she'd built through years of night shift training dissolved in the span of a few short details. That voice on the line was not only calling for help, it was calling for her. Her throat tightened, but she forced each word to remain steady. She knew what came next would demand both parts of her, the disciplined nurse and the terrified mother. And keeping those roles separate, even for a moment, was already proving impossible. Sarah's training urged her to stay orderly. Verify details, document facts, keep assumptions at bay. It was the structure she had leaned on her entire career. But in the same moment, her instincts as a mother cut hard against that discipline. Every fiber of her being told her that waiting was dangerous, that hesitation could mean losing her daughter. One side told her to follow steps. The other demanded she act now. That sharp divide lived in her voice. Out loud, she stayed calm, even, dependable. You're doing so well, sweetheart. Can you tell me what you see right now? Inside, her chest tightened around images she could hardly bear. Her child small, alone, afraid. If this part resonates with you, leave a comment. It helps others feel seen. Her professional mind tried to rationalize. Coincidences exist. Other girls could have a butterfly room. Other children might love dance class or cling to a stuffed bear. Confirmation needed to be beyond doubt before she let herself believe. Her heart didn't agree. Recognition rippled through her in ways no checklist could compensate for. She knew that voice the way someone knows their own handwriting. Unmistakable. The urge to call out her daughter's name pressed hot against her lips. She bit down, teeth to lip, holding the word like a live current in her mouth. Saying it could confirm everything, but it could also break the fragile steadiness the call depended on. The split was brutal. Nurse Sarah continued methodically, asking clipped, guiding questions, with her pen poised on the notepad. Mother Sarah wanted to abandon the desk, to push through the hospital doors and start searching the streets. The demand for composure and the swell of panic met head-on in her chest. Her hands betrayed the truth of that battle. One curled, white-knuckled at her side. The other steadied the receiver with an outward calm that her pulse could not match. She measured her breaths so the child would only hear comfort, not fear. She realized then how limited her training was for this moment. Protocol made sense when the person in crisis was unknown, when distance gave clarity. But here she was both caregiver and parent, responsible professional, and terrified mother. The handbook didn't have a page for this. Each simple question now carried dual meaning. To the nurse, they gathered necessary details, landmarks, surroundings, risks. To the mother, they confirmed identity, piece by piece, until doubt had almost no room left. It was not a gentle convergence, but a tearing in two. Her roles felt as distinct as a line drawn sharply down the center of her being. Every second that passed stretched wide and thin, weighted with contradictions she could neither resolve nor delay. She held the silence after each small answer, like glass in her hands, afraid that one wrong word might shatter what was left of her composure. Her jaw tightened. She knew where this tension was leading. The choice between silence and truth could not be postponed much longer. And as she steadied herself for the next question, the weight of it settled deep in her chest, pressing against every practiced breath. Sarah drew in a slow breath, her fingers tightening on the receiver. She knew the question had to be asked, even as fear coiled in her chest. The child's ragged sniffles came through the line, uneven, fragile against the hush of the nurse's station. "Sweetie," she said, her voice soft but unsteady. "Can you tell me your full name?" The line grew silent, stretched. She could hear faint traffic in the background, night air slipping across the receiver, the fragile hush of someone very small holding their breath. Then the answer came, clear and direct. "Emily Jenkins." The sound of that name hollowed the room around her. Her breath caught, sharp, broken at the edges. Emily Jenkins. The name stitched onto school folders, written on lunchbox labels, whispered in bedtime routines. 2 words that filled her world. In that instant, everything else dropped away. The chatter of distant monitors, the hum of lights, the steady rhythm of the ward, none of it mattered. The phone carried the only sound she could hear, and it had cut straight through her defenses. The details that had built up in fragments, the wanket, the floppy-eared bear, butterfly walls, the dance class, all fused into something undeniable. No longer coincidence, no longer suspicion. It was her daughter, her child alone somewhere in darkness, reaching for her voice as the only tether. Professional calm shattered. Her grip on the counter turned unsteady, pins slipping useless from her fingers. Tears blurred the notes she had started, the words no longer needed. She was not gathering information about a stranger. She was listening to her own child cry for safety she could not yet provide. The nurse's training told her to keep breathing, to hold steady because her voice mattered more than anything. But the mother in her pulsed with raw urgency. She wanted to cross the distance instantly, to scoop Emily into her arms, to keep her from ever needing to make this call again. Clarity settled like a weight she couldn't push aside. Emily was not where she should have been, not tucked at home under a butterfly comforter, not safe within walls she trusted. She was instead stranded by chance and circumstance, holding to a refrigerator phone number as if it were a lifeline. The familiar image rose before her without effort. Emily's small hands clutching Mr. Snuggles tight, her brows pulled together in fear. It struck Sarah with the ache of distance, vivid and unrelenting. Every instinct warned that her little girl was too far away and far too vulnerable. The hospital suddenly felt less like the place Sarah controlled, and more like a barrier, keeping her anchored when she wanted to run. The ordinary desk phone pressed to her cheek was no longer routine equipment. It was the thin thread holding her to Emily. The truth stood naked and inescapable. This wasn't about policy or procedure anymore. This was her daughter, alone in the night. And with that recognition, another question pressed forward with crushing urgency. One she could no longer ignore. How had Emily ended up there at all? Sarah's mind raced. Emily should have been under blankets in her butterfly room, the sitter on the couch within reach, the baby monitor glowing with its steady green light. All the layers of safety Sarah had rehearsed, door locks, alarms, routines, were meant to keep her child tucked safely at home. None of it had held. She kept her tone even as she asked, "Can you tell me how you got outside, sweetheart?" The words felt heavy. Calm questions were her only tool now. "I had a bad dream," Emily said softly. "I called for Mommy, but nobody came. The house was too quiet. I got scared." Sarah's throat tightened. The sitter could have been asleep, worn from a long day. The front lock might not have clicked fully shut. 2 small human lapses, undone by the timing of a nightmare. "I thought I could find you," Emily added, her words trembling. "I saw lights outside that looked like the hospital. I thought if I followed them." Sarah closed her eyes. It made sense in the logic of a frightened child. The street lamps and store signs glowing in the distance would blur into the same brightness Emily associated with her mother's workplace. She pictured her daughter stepping into the dark street, pajamas brushing against her small legs, bare feet testing the cold pavement. In daylight, she knew the neighborhood. At night, it became a maze of shadows. "I walked and walked," Emily whispered through tears, "but the hospital never got closer. Then I got lost. The houses all looked the same." Sarah pressed her hand flat against the counter, steadying herself. She could see it too clearly. Emily trying corner after corner, the familiar turning strange with each step. A tiny figure wandering through rows of identical houses, the warmth of home shrinking behind her. Each detail sank deeper. The lock not fully engaged. The sitter's sleep too heavy. Just 2 small cracks, but together they opened the way for a nightmare to spill into reality. A cascade of small human mistakes had opened the one crack Sarah always feared. Emily's voice wavered again. "I just wanted to find you." The words landed harder than any protocol note. Sarah had counted on alarms, monitors, babysitters, magnets on the fridge, systems she thought would hold against chance. But they hadn't. They had folded under the weight of one exhausted babysitter, one slipped latch, one child's desperate choice. And now, every safeguard she trusted lay useless against the fact that her daughter was somewhere outside in the night, calling to her through a desk phone. The understanding drew a hollow weight through her chest. Fragility had been hiding in plain sight all along, tucked inside the ordinary. What she thought of as stable had been nothing more than a thin net waiting to split. Sarah's pen rested idle, as her daughter's voice carried through the hum of wires. The realization brought no comfort, only urgency. If the safeguards couldn't hold, then it was up to her words alone to keep Emily steady until she could be found. She drew a measured breath, her voice shaping itself back into calm. The only choice now was to keep Emily focused, keep her talking, even while her own panic rose like a tide underneath. Sarah steadied herself against the rush inside her chest. The panic was sharp, physical, as if her ribcage could barely hold it. Her daughter was out there in the night, and the sheer weight of that truth pressed like a stone against her lungs. "Tell me about the stars you can see, sweetie," she said softly. Her voice carried calm, though her insides screamed. She measured each breath so Emily would only hear reassurance, not the frantic beat of her mother's fear. At the same time, her mind began to move with frightening speed. Fragile terror turned into rapid calculations. She ran mental maps of the streets. One spot with a bright convenience store light 2 blocks north. Another gas station glowing 3 blocks east. 2 possible landmarks. 2 places Emily might have confused for her hospital. Each possibility brought its own stab of worry. The 2 halves of herself pulled against each other. The nurse demanded focus, process, data. The mother wanted only to drop everything, to bolt outside and search. For a moment, the conflict felt unbearable, like currents fighting for control of the same body. But then, something inside her began to shift. With deliberate effort, she held her breathing steady for Emily's sake. Fear wanted to fragment her thoughts into chaos. Instead, she forced the pieces of panic into small steps. Questions asked, clues gathered, distances calculated. Her daughter's survival demanded not a scream, but control. She spoke quietly to Emily about constellations, her tone flat and soothing, while her brain mapped routes for police cars and measured how long a child could walk barefoot before exhaustion set in. Protocol and instinct no longer needed to cancel each other out. They could merge if she let them. It was then that the panic crystallized. The pounding in her chest found direction. What had been chaos became a kind of fuel, sharpening every thought. There was no space for abstract dread anymore. Each tremor in Emily's voice became data. Each description of light or sound became a point on the map. Terror had not left her. It lived in every nerve. But it no longer scattered her. It gathered, pressed inward, shaping her into something urgent and prepared. The raw fear of a mother was no longer pulling her away from her training. It was driving her to use it with more precision than ever before. She smiled faintly at the receiver, though her throat ached. "I love how you notice the little things in the sky," she said, her tone steady as water. Emily didn't need to hear the storm. What Emily needed was the warmth of her mother's voice. And behind that voice, Sarah's next steps were already aligning. She knew the only way forward was to keep Emily speaking in safe, familiar rhythms. Stories, games, pieces of ordinary comfort, while her hands and colleagues around her began to act. The balance between her calm words and her urgent planning was about to be tested in full. Sarah kept her voice calm and even. "Tell me about your favorite storybook, sweetie. The one we read at bedtime." The words flowed out like steady threading, quiet enough to soothe a frightened child's breathing on the other end. At the same time, her free hand moved sharply, gesturing to a colleague approaching the desk. Colleen stepped closer, expecting a simple medication note or patient update. Instead, Sarah wrote a single phrase across the chart in quick, heavy strokes. "My daughter lost." She slid the page toward her without breaking tone on the phone. It was just one line, but it landed like a dropped weight. Colleen's expression shifted, her movement tightening as she understood. No further explanation was needed. She slipped away toward the charge nurse, setting the wheels of response in motion. Sarah kept talking about princesses and bedtime adventures, her tone warm and light. Her pen scratched on another page. Pajamas, a bear with one floppy ear, mention of streetlights. She pushed each note forward while her hand shook faintly against the paper. The contrast was stark. Her mouth carried only comfort. Her hands carried alarm. When Emily mentioned what looked like a bakery sign, Sarah's eyes lifted quick to Colleen. With her free hand, she pointed north, sharp and silent, directing attention without cutting the line of gentleness she kept for her daughter. These gestures told others where to focus before her words caught up, each movement woven into the wider effort unfolding around her. The charge nurse coordinated quickly. One call went to security for nearby cameras, another line opened to police dispatch. Within moments, what had been a quiet night's routine began to shift into something organized and urgent. Staff who had been adjusting IV charts only minutes earlier were now gathering descriptions, locating phones, marking maps. Sarah continued her two-channel thinking, holding up both sides of herself at once. On the phone, she was soft reassurance, drawing Emily into talk of storybook endings and favorite characters. In the room, she was swift signals and lists of details that could save her child's life. Her body carried both identities, split but simultaneous. The change in atmosphere spread quickly. Hallway chatter quieted, steps quickened. Colleagues stepped into roles without stopping to debate them, security leaning over screens, nurses connecting with dispatch, clerks leaving behind their paperwork to carry messages. Normal structure gave way to a single coordination of effort. For Sarah, the divide began to blur. Training and instinct no longer fought each other. They lined up in practice. She knew her daughter's fears, knew how Emily described the world, and that knowledge guided every next question. What had been professional protocol blended with personal insight. Stronger together than either one alone. Her voice filled the phone, steady as breath. Around her, the desks and equipment of the ward had turned into an operations floor. Every small motion was tied to the same end, her daughter's safe return. And with that shift, the hospital itself began to feel different, its purpose bending around one child and one mother's call. The staff moved quickly, shifting from routine to response in the span of moments. Conversations about schedules ended. Quiet night tasks were set aside. What mattered now was one child. Security turned to their screens, rewinding footage and freezing frames at key minutes. Empty lots, flickers of headlights, side streets, each image scanned for a small shape in pajamas. One guard leaned forward, pausing the feed at 2:45, studying the shadow of a figure near a lamppost. Administrators lifted the phone lines to police dispatch. Clear, clipped details passed out. Age, height, hair color, and the printed pattern of sleepwear. Each word locked into the record, giving officers exactly what they needed to begin. Nearby, nurses traded roles without pause. A set of vitals charted here, a medication passed there. Tasks covered so Sarah could stay on the line without fear of neglecting other patients. No one asked for direction. They simply acted. The department shifted focus with quiet efficiency. Colleagues who had once greeted Emily on after-school visits now carried trays and pagers with new weight in their shoulders. For them, the missing child was not an abstract case. She had been a familiar presence, coloring pages in the corner of her mother's station. That memory sharpened their pace. Phones that usually rang with routine questions now took updates flowing in from patrol cars. Computer screens that stored patient charts now showed grids and local maps, brought up side by side. Familiar tools were turning into pieces of the search. Protocol flexed as the situation unfolded. Standard missing person steps were in place, but they were narrowed and adjusted minute by minute. A direct communication line opened between security, administrative leads, and law enforcement, fast enough to keep every piece of information from stalling. Doctors and nurses who normally carried separate ranks now worked shoulder to shoulder. The hierarchy that defined most shifts gave way to shared purpose. What mattered was speed, not titles. A vital check could wait 10 seconds, so a landmark description could be relayed. The emergency department, still managing patients on monitors and in beds, became a hub for both kinds of emergencies at once. The care of the sick continued, but layered across it was another mission, urgent and personal. For one night, the room served as a command post, as well as a clinic. Each role found its place in the network. Security understood the footage and perimeter. Administrators pushed out details and logged calls. Nurses knew the language of a restless child, translating Emily's small clues into directions officers could follow. It was not one job, but many, joined together. Even the building itself bent to assist. Floor plans pulled from emergency exit maps provided rough search zones. Radios and intercom channels stood by for updates inside and out. A hospital designed to hold patients briefly became a base for looking beyond its walls. Flexibility kept it balanced. Between rounds and IV checks, staff still leaned toward the phone at the desk. Between calls, they stretched maps across counters. The work never fully stopped, but every person carried two tracks of focus: the usual demands of care and the greater task they now shared. The night's response created a circle far bigger than the walls of the emergency ward. It tied together police, staff, and community tools into one coordinated force. And while teams pressed outward into the streets, attention at the same time began to turn inward, back to the home where all of this started, and to the unanswered questions waiting there. At the same time, the picture at home began to take shape. A colleague reached the babysitter on the phone, her voice groggy and shaken as she answered. Confusion gave way to alarm when she realized Emily wasn't in her bed. She had drifted into deep sleep on the living room couch, worn down by a long day. The baby monitor glowed nearby, but the volume had been too low to stir her awake. In that fragile gap, Emily's calls into the quiet house went unheard. The child had woken from a nightmare so vivid it pushed her from sleep into panic. She called for her mother first, then for the sitter. With no reply, silence pressed in. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards, it all grew louder in solitude. Fear pooled until there was only one thought left to follow. If Mommy wasn't in the house, she must be at the hospital. Emily's path was simple. The front door hadn't latched properly. Its lock required a firm push to engage, and in the routine of tucking a child in, that last push was missed. The door stood slightly ajar, just enough for a small hand to tug it wider. Without alarms armed, nothing stopped her. Two conditions alone, one adult in heavy sleep and one door left loose, were enough to undo the careful safety net built around her. The babysitter, shocked awake by the ringing phone, rushed to Emily's room, only to find the covers thrown back, the step stool nudged toward the doorframe, and the bear, normally nestled by her pillow, gone. Her first words to staff over the line were raw and tangled, the sound of disbelief turning to panic. That reaction mattered more than any long accounting of faults. It was recognizably human. The sound of someone realizing a child had slipped past in the one moment she rested. When officers arrived at the home, their observations matched that story. The door sagged a few inches open. The alarm panel was dark, unarmed. In the bedroom, a small trail of details told the story. The covers tossed aside, the stool dragged out of place. Mr. Snuggles, missing. Each part was painfully ordinary on its own. A caregiver tired enough to sink into deep sleep. A lock not fully pressed. A child stirred by a bad dream. Together, those pieces aligned in the narrowest window possible, enough to let fear carry a small body outside. Like a chain of tiles that fall once tipped, the margin for error collapsed. The babysitter sat in tears as police confirmed the scene. She had kept Emily many times without trouble, and this night was meant to be no different. There was no cruelty in her actions, only the common weight of exhaustion breaking through vigilance. That picture of the home gave clarity. It explained how Emily had woken alone, found her way into the open night, and lifted the hospital's number from the fridge. But it did nothing to change the urgent reality. With the cause understood, the only question now was where to find her. What mattered most was the search already unfolding beyond those walls. Police cruisers swept slowly through neighborhood streets, their spotlights cutting across sidewalks and alleys. At the hospital, security staff moved outside the building, beams from their flashlights sliding over fences, corners, and parking lots. The search was no longer scattered. It was deliberate, coordinated. Every person tuned to the same frequency of urgency. Sarah stayed on the phone, her words soft but steady for Emily, her free hand scribbling the details that mattered most. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what you see now?" A pause, then a small, tired answer. A glowing red sign. A noisy hum, like machines working in the dark. Sarah translated each phrase, giving the officers clear points to follow. That red sign narrowed everything down. The glow belonged to convenience stores more than anything else. The hum could be air units or generators outside commercial buildings. Together, those simple markers focused the search toward the nearest gas stations and late-night shops, the places Emily might have mistaken for a hospital in her fear. Officers checked those areas carefully. Spotlights glided over parking lots crowded with cars, then dipped behind dumpsters and into shadowed alcoves. Doors were rattled, back corners cleared, alleys searched where a small child could crouch in fear. Each sweep blended police precision with Sarah's insight into what her daughter would notice, or where she might try to hide. On the other end of the phone, Emily's words gave clues, but also betrayed her condition. Her voice wavered with fatigue. The tears had slowed, replaced by the flat tone of a child worn down by the night air. Sarah heard every change, knew what it meant, and pushed her questions carefully forward. For the searchers outside, time pressed harder with each round. Radios cracked through the quiet. North Lot clear, moving east. Another reply followed seconds later. No sign at the gas station. Checking the store frontage now. The clipped, efficient updates left little room for comfort, but the sound of voices trading information was its own steady anchor. Inside the hospital, Sarah's endurance leaned on that same rhythm. She could not see the streets. She could not shine a light into the dark. But through the reports and through her daughter's descriptions, she built a map in her mind. Her notes filled with arrows and circles, possibilities crossed off one by one as the net closed tighter. Each minute felt like an hour. Sarah's professional mask never slipped for Emily's sake. Yet underneath, she waited on the turn of the next phrase, the next update, the next chance to bring her child safely back inside a wall she could trust. The combined effort, security eyes on the screens, police out on the streets, hospital staff trading details between calls, formed a mesh around the neighborhood. Everyone carried their part, connected by Sarah's voice as it bridged the two worlds. And as one patrol car slowed beneath a glowing red sign, its spotlight brushed across brick and shadow, sending a faint shape into view. The search had reached its critical edge, the moment where every clue and every breath now pointed in one direction. A police officer's flashlight slid across the side of a convenience store, its beam catching on a small figure pressed tight against the brick wall. The pale shimmer of pink pajamas stood out in the glow, bare feet tucked in against the cold cement. He paused, recognizing the description exactly as it had been relayed. Small frame, cartoon sleepwear, frightened posture. His steps were deliberate, controlled, every movement open and careful. As he drew closer, the child recoiled. She pressed tighter to the wall, her shoulders rising, her body shaking in the harsh circle of light. The officer lowered himself into a crouch several feet away. He kept his hands visible, his voice low, steady, tones practiced for the fragile trust of children and startled animals alike. On the phone, Sarah heard the shift. The calm, even words of a stranger reached her daughter's ears, but Emily only felt the sudden presence of someone unknown. Her whimpers grew sharper, panic peaking, small sobs cutting through the line. Sarah's breath caught. This was the moment she had feared, her daughter too scared to move, too scared to trust. The professional mask she had been holding cracked. Her voice spilled into the phone, thick and unsteady. Emily let her voice break on the word mommy here before softening again. It's mommy, sweetheart. Listen to me. Go with the nice officer. He's going to bring you to me. That word, mommy, cut through the fog. Emily's crying softened, her breaths slowing as recognition took hold. The officer stayed still, allowing that tether between mother and child to calm what his presence could not. Emily's posture shifted. The tight curl of her body loosened just enough for her to glance toward the beam, eyes shining in the dark. The officer didn't rush. He extended his hand slowly, palm up, letting her choose. She hesitated, trembling, but her mother's voice carried steady through the phone. At last, Emily moved. One small hand released its grip on the wall, lifted tentatively, and reached toward him. Her fingers barely brushed his before she committed fully, trusting because her mother had told her to. The officer wrapped her gently in the bulk of his jacket. The sleeves swallowed her frame, and the heavy fabric hung around her shaking shoulders like armor against the night. She leaned into him, the resistance draining away as exhaustion finally overpowered her fear. At the hospital desk, Sarah's knees gave way against the counter. The relief came not as lightness, but as waves that made her arms weak, her throat thick. Tears pushed free at last, not hidden or checked, running openly as her hand covered her mouth. Her colleagues looked on, their own composure folding. The shift in the room was palpable. Professionals reduced for a moment to simple, aching humans. For all their structure and training, the true resolution had come down to something unmeasurable: the power of a mother's voice. Sarah stayed on the line. She heard the rustle of fabric as Emily settled into the officer's hold, the muted sound of a patrol car door opening, then closing with a hollow thud. The steady engine hum followed, carrying her daughter closer with each turn of the wheels. Night air filled the line, mixed with the officer's reassuring tone, his quiet updates marking the distance back to safety. Sarah gripped the receiver tighter, her hand finally steady, listening only for the rhythm of her daughter's breathing. The nightmare had shifted into motion toward its end. Emily was no longer lost to the dark. She was on her way home. And not far ahead, another moment waited. The one Sarah had been aching for since the phone first rang. Sarah waited at the emergency entrance, the automatic doors sliding softly behind her as the patrol car turned into the access road. The cool air pressed against her skin, charged now with anticipation instead of dread. All around, the hospital kept to its routines, but for her, the world had narrowed to that single pair of headlights drawing closer. The car slowed and stopped. For a moment, the low rumble of its engine was the only sound. Then the passenger door opened and an officer stepped out, holding a small bundle wrapped in his jacket. The oversized fabric sagged around the child's shoulders, her small hands gripping it tight. Emily lifted her head. Light from the hospital entrance caught her pale face and tangled hair. Her eyes flicked up, uncertain, then widened when they found her mother's across the pavement. Sarah didn't think. She moved. Her knees hit concrete as her arms opened, ready before a word could form. Emily slipped free of the jacket and ran, her steps unsteady but determined, bare feet slapping against the ground. The child's weight collided into her chest, and Sarah folded her arms around her as if to bind her back into place. She pressed her cheek against the crown of Emily's head, breathing in familiar notes of shampoo layered with night air. Beneath her palms, she could feel the pounding heart inside a thin set of pajamas, a rhythm fast but steadying. Neither spoke at first. Tears threaded down Sarah's face, soaking into her daughter's hair. Emily clung hard to her shoulders, her small body trembling, then easing as the grip of fear gave way to exhaustion. The warmth of their contact said what words could not. Fear was past. Safety restored. The embrace spoke of both absence and return. It carried the raw edges of terror and the heavy flood of relief. More than relief, it bound them back together after the night had stretched too much distance between them. From a few steps away, staff stood still. One nurse covered her mouth with her hand, blinking back unexpected tears. Security lingered at the perimeter light, heads bowed slightly, their job done, but their gaze held by the sight before them. The scene asked for no words, only quiet respect. The sterile brightness of the entrance seemed to shift. Ambulance bay lines, steel stretchers, even the antiseptic walls receded into silence. What filled the space was far more ordinary. The sound of a mother murmuring soft reassurances. The feel of a child's breath evening out against her shoulder. Sarah rocked her gently, one hand tracing slow circles across her back. She could feel the tension ebbing from Emily's limbs, her breathing lengthening into a rhythm that finally matched her mother's. Each small shift signaled a return to calm, inch by inch. The officer stepped back, leaving them their space. For the first time that night, Sarah felt her hands steady. She pressed her lips to her daughter's temple, eyes closing as she let herself sink into the reality of the moment. They stayed that way on the cool concrete, wrapped together while the hospital continued its night around them. The embrace loosened slightly, but neither let go. For both, there was no rush to move, no pull stronger than the need to hold. The ordeal had reached its end. Yet in the stillness of reunion, Sarah understood another truth. The hours ahead would bring not only rest, but reflection. In the hours that followed, Sarah sat by Emily's bedside. The steady rhythm of her child's breathing replaced the night's terror with a fragile calm. Every slight shift of a blanket, every whisper of breath kept Sarah's eyes open. Ordinary moments, once unnoticed, now carried a weight that pressed deep into her chest. The night had revealed 3 truths she could no longer ignore. Even the most familiar routines carried hidden risks. Constant vigilance was not perfection, but attention, the steady choice to notice small gaps. And gratitude, raw and simple, would forever mark the act of watching her child sleep safely again. She thought of how close oversight had come to disaster. A door not fully latched, a caregiver too deeply asleep to stir. Just 2 small lapses opened the space for fear to take root. Safety, she realized, was never a wall, but a net. Thin and strong only if checked time and again. Her instincts as both nurse and mother combined into something firmer. At work, she had always known the importance of rapid triage, of scanning for details before they fell through cracks. Now, that same discipline was threaded with personal urgency. Emergencies were not just lines on a chart. They were someone's family balanced on a fragile edge. That awareness would shape her hands from this night forward. For Sarah, the professional no longer stood apart from the personal. They braided together in the way her voice had cracked yet stayed steady on the line. It was not a loss of composure. It was the knowledge of risk drawn closer, made clearer by the face of her own child. She nodded solemnly at this truth, knowing it sat in her now like a permanent layer beneath her skin. Around her, the hospital staff's actions weighted the memory. Colleagues had rallied, fast, efficient, steady. But what stayed with Sarah was not the pace of the search. It was smaller. The touch of a nurse's hand on her shoulder, or the quiet moment when one staff member turned away to blink back tears. These details reminded her that safety was never hers alone to uphold. It was always shared. That thought expanded outward. Safety was not a fence, not a checklist finished in one sitting. It was dozens of daily choices repeated, often invisible. She began to see her home not as a sealed space, but as a living system, always in need of tending, like a roof that holds until small cracks widen from silence. That awareness carried no panic with it now, only a sober respect for what needed care. For you listening, take one moment here. Look around your own routines, the doors, the numbers posted, the people you trust to watch over your children. Small oversights can open larger risks than we wish to imagine. Checking them takes only seconds, and those seconds matter more than we sometimes realize. By the time the morning light filtered into the windows, Sarah's resolve sharpened. Awareness was not enough by itself. Awareness needed to be paired with action, with small, deliberate changes that would carry the lessons of this night into tomorrow. And as her daughter slept on in safe, exhausted peace, Sarah gathered herself for what must come next. The careful work of reshaping their daily protections into something stronger. By the next morning, the family began shaping their home with quiet, deliberate changes. The work wasn't about fear. It was about replacing a fragile night with small protections that felt steady, simple, and real. The first step was visibility. Emergency numbers were written in large, clear print on brightly colored cards and placed at a child's eye level. The refrigerator door, the bathroom mirror, and the wall near the television now each held numbers Emily could spot easily. They practiced them together often, turning it into a little game of pretend calls. What could have been a point of panic became a way for Emily to feel capable and prepared. The second adjustment was sound. New door chimes were added that gave off a gentle tone whenever opened after dark. These weren't shrill alarms meant to frighten. They were soft notes, like a small bell, subtle enough to avoid startling a child, but firm enough to rouse an adult. Each evening, the system was tested as part of the routine. An active reminder to both parents and child that safety was something you could hear, not just hope for. The third step was practice. Safety drills were quietly woven into the household rhythm, kept short and calm. Emily was guided through what to do if she ever felt scared at home, how to call for help, and how to stay put until someone came. Each drill used encouraging tones and playful cues, presented more like a story than a test. The goal wasn't urgency, but confidence, so the habits would take root without adding weight to a young child's mind. Together, these 3 measures reshaped the ordinary into something steady. Safety became part of routine life, as natural as brushing teeth before bed. The numbers became familiar. The chime became expected. The drills became a normal kind of game. Repetition made them comfortable, and through those small adjustments, the family found balance. Cautious enough to be aware of risk, but gentle enough to keep fear at bay. None of it was complicated. Each change was simple, the kind of step almost any family could reproduce with little more than paper and attention. Yet these details carried heavy meaning. They weren't only objects or sounds. They were proof that lessons from one frightening night were being carried forward with purpose. The shift extended beyond locks and numbers. Emily felt herself included in the process, not just shielded by it. By pressing a test button on a door chime or reciting a phone number with a giggle, she learned that safety wasn't something given to her in silence. It was something she could share in actively. That sense of involvement strengthened the very bond between mother and child, layering protection with trust. Each choice echoed a single intention. Their home would not only be a place to sleep, but a place that listened, prepared, and watched over those inside it. With that structure built firmly into the rhythm of each day, the family began to notice something else shifting too. Ordinary routines, closing the door at night, switching off a light, slipping a note onto the fridge, took on quiet weight. They weren't just chores, they were signals of care, proof that safety was being tended in simple acts. And as those habits settled in, something deeper followed. Moments at home no longer carried only the memory of fear. They began instead to carry a sense of connection, where even the smallest tasks grew into symbols of love held steady across long days and quiet nights. The bond that grew between Sarah and Emily in the days that followed felt quieter but stronger. It was not shaped by grand gestures, but by small, steady moments that pulsed with new meaning. This was their unbreakable bond. Tested, stretched, and then reinforced by the night they both survived. Each evening, Sarah noticed herself lingering a little longer at Emily's bedside. The act of tucking in a blanket or brushing hair back from a forehead now carried its own weight. A longer goodnight hug became their new ritual. Not heavy with fear, but filled with a steady gratitude that they were together, safe. In the soft rhythm of mornings, simple acts took on a new tone. Making breakfast or walking to school remained ordinary, yet each carried a quiet undercurrent of appreciation. These weren't celebrations exactly, but acknowledgments. Small, unspoken marks that the everyday still held. Sarah also noticed how Emily began to process the experience. Children carry fear differently than adults, folding it into play, into questions, into moments of silence. Emily spoke of the night now and then in scattered words, but moved quickly back into life, her resilience clear. The fear had touched her, but it did not define her. What surfaced instead was courage, small but unmistakable. That resilience gave Sarah both comfort and responsibility. She felt the need to steady her daughter's confidence, to reinforce what Emily now believed deep down, that when she called for her mother, help came. That truth, rooted in the sound of her mother's voice on a fragile line, became part of Emily's trust in the world. Their connection, scarred but strengthened, grew more intricate. It was not about erasing the memory, but absorbing it. The night lived in their story, but as one chapter among many, not as the book's ending. It added depth to their love, without placing limits on their future. At work, Sarah found herself changed too. She carried new empathy into her nursing, remembering how the line between professional and personal can collapse in an instant. When she soothed a worried parent in the ward, she now spoke from a different layer of knowing. At home, her daughter felt the benefits. Sarah's caregiver voice tempered by the lived weight of her own fear and relief. She also saw how others had stitched into this bond. The hospital staff who had bent routines to help, the officers who had searched the dark roads, all became part of the net that had caught Emily. Strangers had turned into allies, colleagues into family. Protection, she realized, was bigger than what one person alone could hold. Yet through all of that, the theme remained simple. Love had endured when fear threatened to unravel it. What bound them together had faced its harshest test and remained unbroken. That alone reframed how they looked at ordinary life, not with fragility, but with steady trust. Two truths crystallized in Sarah's mind. Her daughter's resilience was greater than she had fully seen, and their connection had deepened into something she could only call unshakable. Those truths settled in like anchors, quiet but immovable. The memory of that night lingered as a shape in the background, a reminder but not a shadow. It urged them to check doors more carefully and taught them to hug longer. It shaped their vigilance, but it did not claim their joy. They had faced darkness, but what remained was not fear. It was the bond they carried forward. A bond that could bend under strain but not break. a bond that would continue to frame their lives, guiding them not with dread, but with gratitude. And as they moved forward, that knowledge stood steady between them, pointing toward something larger, an understanding that would extend beyond their own home, toward every family that faces the quiet fragility of ordinary life. Before you go, take a moment. If you didn't earlier, share where you're watching from in the comments. It helps us see the community gathered here. The heart of this story is simple. Love and preparation matter. One holds you steady, the other keeps you ready. What's one small safety step you use at home? Write it in the comments. Your idea might give another family exactly what they need. And if you want more true stories about family strength and protection, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We post every week, sharing lives shaped by both fear and care.